The morning mist clung to the abandoned streets of Cedar Falls like a shroud, masking the horror that had consumed the once thriving town. Zephyra Martinez pressed her back against the cold brick wall of the veterinary clinic, her breath forming small clouds in the October air. Through the cracked window beside her, she could see them, dozens of shuffling figures with their distinctive jerky movements and hollow eyes. The infected had overrun the town 3 days ago, but Zephyra wasn't about to become another casualty. Her calloused hands gripped the modified crossbow she'd crafted from salvaged materials, each bolt meticulously sharpened and weighted for maximum impact. As a former military engineer turned wilderness survival instructor, Zephyra possessed skills that most people never imagined they'd need. Now, those skills were the only thing standing between her and a gruesome death. The sound of breaking glass echoed from across the street, followed by a woman's sharp whistle, a signal Zephyra recognized. Phoenix Blackwood was in trouble. The former Olympic archer had been scouting the pharmacy for medical supplies when the horde had shifted direction. Now she was trapped, and Zephyra could see the telltale signs of panic in her usually steady movements. Without hesitation, Zephyra sprinted across the debris-littered asphalt, her boots silent despite the urgency. She'd learned long ago that noise meant death in this new world. The infected turned toward the sound of Phoenix's movements, their rotting forms converging on the pharmacy like moths to a flame. Zephyra reached the building's rear entrance just as Phoenix appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. 20 of them, maybe more, Phoenix whispered, her professional archer's eye already calculating angles and distances. They followed the scent trail from the injured woman we helped yesterday. Zephyra nodded grimly. Compassion had become a luxury they could barely afford, yet neither woman could turn away from someone in need. It was both their strength and their potential downfall. The infected pressed against the pharmacy's front windows, their decaying hands leaving bloody smears on the glass. We need Temperance, Zephyra muttered, scanning the rooftops for any sign of their third companion. Dr. Temperance Rivers had been tracking a group of survivors reportedly holed up in the old church on the hill. As a former trauma surgeon turned urban survival expert, she possessed medical knowledge that had saved their lives countless times, but her real gift was her ability to read people and situations with uncanny accuracy. A sharp crack split the air, and one of the infected dropped to the ground, an arrow protruding from its skull. Phoenix had found her rhythm, each shot precise and deadly. But they both knew that noise would attract more of the creatures, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. The pharmacy's front door splintered under the weight of countless rotting bodies. Phoenix grabbed a backpack full of medical supplies while Zephyra provided cover with her crossbow. They moved with the fluid coordination of women who had learned to trust each other completely in a world where trust meant survival. The church, Phoenix gasped as they slipped out the back exit. We need to reach Temperance before. Her words were cut off by a scream that chilled their blood. It came from the direction of the church, a sound of pure terror that spoke of unspeakable horror. Both women exchanged a look that conveyed volumes. Their friend was in deadly danger, and they were her only hope. As they began their desperate ascent toward the church, Zephyra reflected on how drastically their lives had changed. 6 months ago, she'd been teaching corporate executives how to start fires and purify water during weekend retreats. Phoenix had been preparing for the Tokyo Olympics, her entire world focused on hitting targets with mechanical precision. Now they were using those same skills to survive in a nightmare landscape where the dead refused to stay buried. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that their exceptional abilities, skills that had once seemed like mere talents or career choices, had become the difference between life and death. Zephyra's engineering background allowed her to fortify shelters and create weapons from scraps. Phoenix's archery prowess made her a silent killer capable of taking down infected from incredible distances. And Temperance's medical expertise kept them healthy and functional when injuries or illness threatened to slow them down. But as they climbed the hill toward the church, both women understood that their greatest test was yet to come. The infected were evolving, becoming more cunning and organized. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, their friend was fighting for her life against odds that seemed insurmountable. The church bells began to toll, a sound that hadn't been heard since the outbreak began. It was Temperance's emergency signal, a call for help that echoed across the desolate landscape like a prayer to a god who seemed to have abandoned them all. The church bells continued their mournful song as Zephyra and Phoenix navigated through the overgrown cemetery that surrounded the old stone building. Weathered headstones jutted from the earth like broken teeth, their inscriptions worn smooth by decades of wind and rain. The irony of seeking refuge among the dead while being hunted by the undead wasn't lost on either woman. Phoenix paused behind a moss-covered mausoleum, her trained eyes scanning the church's Gothic architecture for signs of movement. The building had been constructed in the 1800s, its thick stone walls and narrow windows making it an ideal fortress, if one could reach it alive. Through the stained glass windows, they could see flickering candlelight, a sign that temperance was still inside and still fighting. "There," Zephyra whispered, pointing to a cluster of infected gathered around the church's main entrance. "At least 30 of them, but they're not trying to break in. They're waiting." Phoenix frowned, her archer's instincts recognizing something wrong with the scene. The infected weren't displaying their usual mindless aggression. Instead, they stood in an almost organized formation, swaying slightly as if responding to some unheard command. It was behavior either woman had witnessed before, and it sent chills down their spines. A memory surfaced in Zephyra's mind, her childhood in rural Texas, where her grandmother had told stories about the old ways, about forces that science couldn't explain. Her grandmother had claimed that some places held memories, that tragedy could leave an imprint on the very stones and soil. Looking at the church now, surrounded by creatures that shouldn't exist, Zephyra wondered if those old stories might contain more truth than she'd ever imagined. The bells stopped tolling abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence that seemed to press against their eardrums. In that quiet moment, they heard something that made their blood run cold, singing. A woman's voice, clear and beautiful, drifted from within the church. But it wasn't Temperance's voice. Phoenix pulled out her binoculars, studying the church's bell tower. "Movement up there," she reported. "Someone's in the tower, but I can't make out who." As the mysterious singing continued, the infected began to move with more purpose, their shambling gait becoming more coordinated. Some were heading toward the church's side entrance, while others spread out to surround the building completely. It was strategic thinking that defied everything they thought they knew about the creatures. Zephyra's mind raced through their options. Her engineering background had taught her to analyze problems systematically, to find weaknesses in any structure or situation. The church had 3 entrances: the main door, a side door near the altar, and a small entrance through the basement. The basement entrance would be their best bet, assuming they could reach it without being detected. "We go underground," Zephyra decided. "There's a storm drain that runs beneath the cemetery. I noticed it when we first arrived in town. If it connects to the church's foundation." Phoenix nodded, already understanding the plan. They would have to army crawl through darkness and potentially contaminated water, but it was better than facing 30 infected in open combat. As a former Olympian, Phoenix had endured grueling training conditions, but nothing had prepared her for the claustrophobic terror of underground tunnels filled with unknown dangers. They located the storm drain's entrance hidden beneath a tangle of dead vines. The metal grate had been damaged, leaving just enough space for them to squeeze through. Zephyra went first, her smaller frame making it easier to navigate the tight space. The tunnel was older than she'd expected, its brick walls slick with moisture and decades of accumulated grime. As they crawled through the stifling darkness, Zephyra couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every scrape of their clothing against the tunnel walls seemed amplified, every breath echoing like thunder in the confined space. Behind her, Phoenix's breathing was steady and controlled, but Zephyra could sense her friend's growing anxiety. The tunnel began to angle upward, and Zephyra felt a flutter of hope. They were ascending toward the church's foundation. But as they drew closer to their destination, they began to hear other sounds, scratching, scraping, and what sounded like whispered conversations in a language either woman recognized. Light appeared ahead, filtering down through what looked like a basement window. But the light was wrong, too blue, too cold. And the singing had stopped, replaced by a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the tunnel walls themselves. Zephyr emerged from the tunnel into a basement that defied explanation. The walls were covered with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the strange blue light. Candles burned with that same cold flame, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. And in the center of the room stood a figure that made both women's breath catch in their throats. It was a woman, tall and elegant, wearing clothes that seemed to belong to another century. Her skin was pale as moonlight, and her eyes held depths that spoke of knowledge no living person should possess. She turned toward them with a smile that was both beautiful and terrifying. "Welcome," she said, her voice the same one they'd heard singing. "I've been waiting for you. My name is Cordelia Ravencrest, and I have so much to tell you about what's really happening in this town." Above them, they could hear footsteps and muffled voices. Temperance was still alive, but she wasn't alone. And as Cordelia began to speak, both Zephyr and Phoenix realized that everything they thought they knew about the outbreak was about to change. The infected weren't random victims of some biological catastrophe. They were part of something far older and more sinister than either woman had dared to imagine. Cordelia Ravencrest moved with fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics, her long dress trailing behind her without making a sound. The basement's impossible blue flames cast dancing shadows on the symbol-covered walls, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a fever dream than reality. Zephyr's engineering mind struggled to process what she was seeing, while Phoenix's archer instincts screamed that they were in the presence of a predator unlike any they'd encountered. "You're wondering about the infected," Cordelia said, her voice carrying an odd resonance that seemed to echo from multiple directions. "You've been thinking of them as victims of some virus or biological weapon. How charmingly modern of you." She gestured toward the symbols on the walls, and Zephyr noticed that some of them appeared to be moving, shifting their shapes when she wasn't looking directly at them. "This town was built on sacred ground, sacred to people your history books prefer to forget. When the colonists arrived, they found a thriving community that understood the delicate balance between life and death, between the world of the living and the realm of the departed." Phoenix stepped forward, her hand instinctively reaching for an arrow. "What does any of this have to do with what's happening now?" Cordelia's laugh was like silver bells in a storm. "Everything, dear Archer. You see, the colonists didn't just drive out the native inhabitants, they desecrated their most holy sites, built their churches on top of ceremonial grounds, buried their dead in soil that was meant to remain undisturbed. And now, after centuries of spiritual imbalance, the barrier between worlds has grown thin." Above them, they heard a crash followed by Temperance's voice shouting instructions. It sounded like she was barricaded somewhere, directing other survivors and fortifying their position. But there was something else, other voices responding to her, voices that sounded strangely hollow and distant. Zephyr forced herself to focus on practical matters, even as her worldview crumbled around her. "If you know what's causing this, then you know how to stop it." "Stop it?" Cordelia's eyes gleamed with an inner light. "My dear engineer, why would I want to stop something I've spent 3 centuries working to achieve?" The temperature in the basement plummeted, and both women could see their breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. Phoenix knocked an arrow, her Olympic training overriding her fear. But as she drew back the bowstring, Cordelia held up a pale hand. "Please, there's no need for violence. I'm not your enemy, at least, not in the way you think. You see, I was among the first to die when this town was established. Accused of witchcraft, burned at the stake in the very spot where the church now stands. But death, I discovered, is not always permanent for those who understand its true nature." Zephyr's mind raced, trying to reconcile what she was hearing with everything she believed about the world. As an engineer, she dealt in facts, measurements, provable realities. But the evidence of her senses was undeniable. They were speaking to someone who claimed to have been dead for 3 centuries. "The infected aren't random," Cordelia continued. "They're the descendants of those who wronged my people, called back to face judgment for the sins of their ancestors. But you 3, you're different. You possess skills that transcend the ordinary, abilities that mark you as something special." A new sound echoed through the church above, rhythmic pounding, as if something large and heavy was striking the walls. Phoenix's enhanced hearing, developed through years of competitive archery, picked up nuances that others might miss. "That's not the infected," she whispered. "It's too organized, too purposeful." Cordelia nodded approvingly. "Very good. No, it's not the infected. It's something else entirely, something I've called forth to test whether you're truly worthy of what I'm about to offer you." Through the basement's small windows, they could see shapes moving in the cemetery, tall, shadowy figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. These weren't the shambling infected they'd grown accustomed to fighting. These entities moved with purpose and intelligence, and they were converging on the church from all directions. "Temperance is in danger," Zephyra stated, her protective instincts overriding her fear. "Dr. Temperance Rivers is currently treating the wounded survivors she found hiding in the church's upper chambers," Cordelia replied. "But yes, she's in considerable danger. The entities I've summoned don't distinguish between the innocent and the guilty, they simply hunger for life force. Unless, of course, someone were to guide them away from their intended targets." The implication was clear. Cordelia was offering them a deal. Phoenix's grip tightened on her bow. "What do you want from us?" "I want you to help me restore the balance that was destroyed so long ago. I want you to use your extraordinary skills not just to survive, but to cleanse this land of the corruption that has poisoned it for generations. In return, I'll teach you things about yourselves that you never imagined, abilities that go far beyond anything you've discovered so far." Zephyra studied the symbols on the walls, her analytical mind beginning to recognize patterns within the chaos. Some of the markings resembled engineering diagrams, but they described forces and energies that no modern science acknowledged. Others looked like medical illustrations, but they depicted aspects of human anatomy that shouldn't exist. "And if we refuse?" Phoenix asked. Cordelia's smile faded, and for a moment, her beautiful face revealed something ancient and implacable. "Then your friend upstairs dies, along with the survivors she's trying to protect. And eventually, so do you. Because what's happening in this town is spreading, my dear Archer. Other sites of spiritual significance are awakening. Other wrongs are demanding to be righted." The pounding above grew more intense, and they could hear Temperance shouting orders with increasing urgency. Whatever was attacking the church's upper levels was pressing its assault, and time was running out. Zephyra looked at Phoenix, seeing her own internal struggle reflected in her friend's eyes. They had come to save Temperance, but now they were faced with a choice that could determine not just their survival, but their very souls. The decision hung in the air like smoke from the impossible blue flames, thick with consequence and desperation. Above them, the sounds of battle intensified, Temperance's voice rising above the chaos as she coordinated what sounded like a losing fight. Zephyra's analytical mind catalogued every sound, splintering wood, shattering glass, and underneath it all, a low keening that seemed to come from the entities themselves. Phoenix's bowstring remained taut, arrow nocked and ready, but she knew that conventional weapons would be useless against whatever Cordelia truly was. Her Olympic training had taught her to make split-second decisions under pressure, but this choice carried implications that stretched far beyond any competition she'd ever faced. "Show us," Zephyra said suddenly, her engineering pragmatism cutting through the supernatural melodrama. "If you want us to believe you can enhance our abilities, prove it. Show us what you're offering before we agree to anything." Cordelia's expression shifted to one of genuine surprise, then appreciation. "How refreshingly direct. Very well, but understand that even a small demonstration will begin to change you. Once you've tasted true power, there's no returning to who you were before." She moved to the center of the basement, her hands tracing patterns in the air that left brief trails of silver light. The symbols on the walls began to pulse in rhythm with her movements, and the temperature dropped even further. Zephyra felt something stirring deep within her chest, a warmth that seemed to radiate outward from her heart. "Your engineering mind," Cordelia addressed Zephyra directly, "has always been able to visualize how things work, how they fit together. But what if you could see the hidden connections that bind all things? What if you could perceive the structural weaknesses not just in buildings and machines, but in reality itself?" As she spoke, Zephyra's vision began to change. The basement walls became transparent, revealing the complex network of pipes, wires, and support beams that ran throughout the church. But beyond that, she could see energy flowing through everything, streams of force that connected every object, every person, every living and unliving thing in an intricate web of cause and effect. Phoenix gasped as her own transformation began. Her archer's eye, already supernaturally precise, expanded beyond the physical realm. She could see the trajectory not just of arrows, but of possibilities themselves, the paths that events might take, the weak points in fate itself that could be exploited with the right application of force. The infected, Phoenix whispered, her enhanced perception revealing truths that chilled her soul. They're not random. Each one is connected to specific family lines, specific bloodlines that trace back to the original colonists who committed the atrocities. Cordelia finished. Yes, now you begin to understand. This isn't a plague in the traditional sense, it's a reckoning that's been building for 3 centuries. Zephyr's expanded awareness showed her the church's structural integrity in perfect detail. But more than that, she could see the spiritual architecture that Cordelia had been describing. The building sat at the intersection of multiple energy lines, like a hub in a vast network that stretched across the continent. The pounding above reached a crescendo, followed by a woman's scream that definitely wasn't Temperance. Someone else was up there, multiple someones, based on the overlapping voices Zephyra could now distinguish with her enhanced perception. We need to get up there, Phoenix said, but her voice sounded strange, as if it was coming from multiple directions at once. The basement's acoustics had somehow changed, or perhaps her hearing had evolved beyond normal human parameters. Indeed you do, Cordelia agreed. But first, you must understand the full scope of what you're agreeing to. The power I'm offering comes with responsibility. You won't just be fighting the infected, you'll be fighting the corruption that created them. You'll be instruments of justice for wrongs that most people have forgotten ever occurred. Through her transformed vision, Zephyra could see the entities that surrounded the church more clearly now. They weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were manifestations of unresolved trauma, psychic wounds that had been festering in the spiritual fabric of the land for generations. Each one represented a specific injustice, a particular cruelty that demanded acknowledgement and redress. The people upstairs? Phoenix asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Are they? Some are innocent, Cordelia replied. Temperance, for instance, has no ancestral connection to the original crimes. Her bloodline traces to immigrants who arrived much later. But others, she gestured upward. Others carry the weight of their forebears' sins, whether they know it or not. The moral complexity of the situation crashed down on both women like a physical weight. They weren't just being asked to fight monsters, they were being recruited as instruments of supernatural justice, asked to decide who deserved salvation and who deserved judgment. Zephyra's enhanced perception showed her the structural weak points throughout the church, places where a precisely applied force could bring down walls or create new passages. But she could also see the spiritual weak points, places where the barrier between worlds was thinnest, where the past pressed most heavily against the present. Temperance is trying to protect them all, Phoenix observed, her enhanced awareness picking up the emotional resonance of her friend's actions upstairs. She doesn't know about the bloodlines, the connections. She's just doing what she thinks is right. Which is why she needs you, Cordelia said. Your friend has the medical knowledge to heal physical wounds, but she lacks the ability to see the spiritual infections that plague these people. She's treating symptoms while the disease continues to spread. A new sound echoed through the church, Temperance's voice, but distorted somehow, as if she was speaking through some kind of amplification system. Her words were indistinct, but the tone was one of desperate negotiation, as if she was trying to reason with something that couldn't be reasoned with. Time was running out, and both women knew it. Whatever choice they made in the next few moments would determine not just their own fates, but the fate of everyone in the church above. The power Cordelia offered was seductive, but it came with a price that neither of them fully understood. As they prepared to ascend into the chaos above, both Zephyra and Phoenix realized that they were no longer the same women who had entered the basement. The changes had already begun, and there was no going back. Part 5: Ascension and Revelation. The wooden stairs creaked under their weight as Zephyra and Phoenix climbed toward the main floor of the church, their enhanced abilities making every sound, every vibration, feel magnified tenfold. Cordelia followed behind them like a whisper made manifest, her presence both reassuring and deeply unsettling. The transformation they'd undergone in the basement had left both women feeling like strangers in their own bodies, their familiar skills now augmented by perceptions that stretched beyond the realm of ordinary human experience. As they reached the main sanctuary, the scene that greeted them defied comprehension. Temperance stood at the altar, her surgeon's hands steady despite the chaos surrounding her. She was treating a group of survivors, 7 people of various ages, all bearing wounds that looked more like spiritual lacerations than physical injuries. Their eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of confrontation with forces beyond their understanding. But it was the entities surrounding them that truly staggered the imagination. The creatures Cordelia had summoned weren't the shambling infected they'd grown accustomed to fighting. These beings stood 8 feet tall, their forms shifting between solid matter and something that resembled living shadow. They moved with purpose and intelligence, their eyeless faces turning toward the altar with expressions of what could only be described as judicial consideration. Through her enhanced perception, Zephyra could see the connections, threads of energy that linked each entity to specific individuals among the survivors. Some threads glowed with accusatory light, while others remained dim and neutral. The spiritual architecture of the church channeled these connections, amplifying them into a cosmic courtroom where past sins were being weighed against present souls. Phoenix's evolved archer instincts revealed the tactical situation with crystalline clarity. The entities weren't attacking randomly, they were evaluating, each one serving as prosecutor, judge, and potential executioner for crimes committed by ancestors long dead. Her enhanced vision showed her the kill shots that would be necessary to stop them, but she also saw something else, the profound sadness that radiated from these beings like heat from a forge. Temperance, Zephyra called out, her voice carrying new harmonics that seemed to resonate through the church's stone walls. Don't try to treat their physical wounds. The damage isn't medical, it's spiritual. Her friend looked up from bandaging an elderly man's arm, confusion and relief warring in her expression. Zephyra! Phoenix! Thank God you're here. I've been trying to help these people, but nothing I do seems to work. Their injuries keep reopening, as if something is preventing them from healing. One of the shadow entities turned its attention toward the newcomers, and when it spoke, its voice seemed to come from the very stones of the church itself. The engineer and the archer have chosen to see truth. They bear the mark of the witness now. But the healer remains blind to the deeper wounds that fester in this place. Temperance's eyes widened as she processed the implications of what she was seeing. Her medical training had taught her to trust empirical evidence, but the evidence before her challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. What are these things? What do they want? Cordelia materialized beside the altar, her presence causing the entities to bow their heads in acknowledgement. They are the accumulated weight of unaddressed injustice, Dr. Rivers. Each one represents a specific crime, murder, theft of land, destruction of sacred sites, committed by the ancestors of some of the people you're trying to save. Through her enhanced awareness, Phoenix could see the specific connections with devastating clarity. The elderly man Temperance had been treating was descended from a colonial merchant who had poisoned an entire native village to steal their land. The middle-aged woman huddled by the pews carried the bloodline of a judge who had condemned innocent people to death for practicing their traditional beliefs. But there were others whose spiritual threads remained clean. A young boy, perhaps 12 years old, showed no ancestral connections to the historical atrocities. His parents had immigrated from Ireland only 2 generations ago, long after the original crimes had been committed. The entities ignored him completely, their attention focused solely on those who bore the weight of inherited guilt. Zephyra's engineering mind struggled to process the moral complexity of the situation. So you're saying that people should be held responsible for crimes their ancestors committed? That seems fundamentally unjust. One of the entities turned toward her, and she felt its attention like a physical weight. The crimes were never acknowledged, never atoned for. The stolen wealth passed down through generations, built upon foundations of blood and suffering. The victims were never given justice, never allowed to rest. How is it unjust to demand that the benefits of crime be returned to those who were wronged? Temperance moved protectively in front of her patients, her medical oath compelling her to defend them regardless of their ancestral connections. These people didn't commit those crimes. They're innocent. Innocent of the original acts, perhaps, Cordelia acknowledged. But not innocent of benefiting from them. Every acre of land their families own, every dollar of inherited wealth, every opportunity that came to them instead of to the descendants of the victims, all of it built upon a foundation of unacknowledged murder and theft. Phoenix found herself seeing both sides with painful clarity. Her enhanced perception showed her the truth of what Cordelia was saying, the vast network of cause and effect that connected past atrocities to present inequalities. But she also saw the genuine fear and confusion of the people Temperance was trying to protect, most of whom had no knowledge of their ancestral connections to historical crimes. The youngest entity, one whose form seemed slightly more solid than the others, approached the group directly. When it spoke, its voice carried the echo of wind through prairie grass. We do not seek revenge for its own sake. We seek acknowledgement, restitution, and most importantly, the breaking of cycles that continue to cause harm. Some among you carry bloodlines that still perpetuate the same injustices in new forms. Through the church windows, they could see more entities gathering in the cemetery, their numbers growing as night deepened. This wasn't just about Cedar Falls. It was part of something much larger, a reckoning that stretched across the entire continent wherever similar injustices had been committed and then forgotten. Zephyr's enhanced vision showed her the structural integrity of the church beginning to weaken under the spiritual pressure. The building itself was rejecting the weight of accumulated injustice, and if something didn't change soon, the entire structure would collapse, taking everyone inside with it. There has to be another way, she said, her engineer's mind seeking solutions even in the face of supernatural complexity. Some way to address the injustices without destroying the innocent. Cordelia's expression softened slightly. Perhaps there is. But it would require more than just acknowledgement, it would require active participation in setting things right. Are you prepared for that level of commitment? As if in response to her words, Temperance's patients began to change, their spiritual wounds manifesting as visible marks on their skin, symbols that matched those they'd seen in the basement, but written in what looked like burned scars and fresh cuts. The entities waited, their judgment suspended, as the three women faced the most difficult decision of their lives. Part 6. The Weight of Truth. The transformation of Temperance's patients was both horrifying and oddly beautiful. The spiritual wounds that had been invisible to conventional medical examination now blazed across their skin in intricate patterns of light and shadow. Each mark told a story, a chronicle of violence, theft, and betrayal that stretched back through generations. The elderly man's arm bore the image of flames consuming a village, while the middle-aged woman's forehead displayed a hanging tree with 13 bodies swaying in an unfelt wind. Temperance stared at her patients with a mixture of professional fascination and deep horror. Her enhanced perception, triggered by proximity to the other's transformation, now allowed her to see the spiritual pathology that her medical training had never prepared her to treat. Each person carried wounds that had been passed down through bloodlines like a genetic inheritance of guilt. "This is impossible," she whispered, but even as she spoke the words, her surgeon's hands were already moving to examine the new symptoms. "These markings, they're not tattoos or scars. There's something else entirely. It's as if their DNA is expressing historical trauma as physical manifestations." Phoenix's evolved archery instincts revealed the tactical implications with stark clarity. The entities weren't just judging the survivors, they were transforming them, forcing them to carry the visible weight of their ancestors' crimes. But the process was doing something else as well. The spiritual threads connecting each person to their historical guilt were becoming more tangible, more manipulable. "Can you see the connections now?" Cordelia asked, her voice carrying notes of ancient satisfaction. "Each thread represents a choice point, a moment where active restitution can begin to heal the wounds that have festered for so long." Through her enhanced vision, Zephyra could see the church's spiritual architecture more clearly than ever. The building sat at the center of a vast web of cause and effect, but the web was damaged, incomplete. The missing connections represented all the acknowledgments that had never been made, all the apologies that had never been offered, all the restitution that had never been attempted. The young boy who had shown no ancestral connections to the historical crimes suddenly spoke up, his voice clear and unafraid. "My grandmother told me stories," he said, looking directly at one of the entities. "Stories about people who lived here before the town was built. She said they were healers and teachers, and that they were murdered for trying to protect their sacred places." The entity he addressed seemed to solidify slightly, its shadow form taking on more defined features. "Your grandmother spoke truth, young one. But more than that, she carried the responsibility of memory when others chose to forget." Temperance realized with growing clarity that this was about more than just inherited guilt. It was about inherited responsibility, the obligation to acknowledge historical wrongs and work toward healing the wounds they had created. Her medical training had taught her that some infections could lie dormant for years before manifesting symptoms, and what they were witnessing was the spiritual equivalent of a systemic infection finally coming to the surface. "The people in this town," she said, her analytical mind working through the implications, "they're not just random victims. They're here because their ancestors were connected to this place, to what happened here. Cedar Falls was built on the site of a thriving indigenous community," Cordelia confirmed. "The colonists didn't just drive out the inhabitants, they systematically destroyed everything that connected them to their ancestral homeland. Sacred groves were cut down, burial grounds were desecrated, and the survivors were scattered to the winds. But the land remembers, and now it's calling its children home." Through the church windows, they could see the infected moving through the town with more purpose than ever before. They weren't just wandering aimlessly, they were gathering at specific locations, places where the most significant atrocities had occurred. The veterinary clinic where Zephyra and Phoenix had first taken shelter had been built on the site of a massacre. The pharmacy they'd raided for supplies stood where a sacred healing lodge had once provided medicine to the entire region. Phoenix's enhanced perception revealed something else. The infected weren't trying to attack the entities. They were trying to communicate with them, to share the burden of unresolved trauma that they carried. The shambling movements that had seemed mindless were actually attempts at a ritual dance, a desperate effort to perform ceremonies that had been lost for generations. "They remember," Phoenix breathed, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "The infected, they're not just random victims. They're carrying genetic memories of the original inhabitants, trying to complete rituals that were interrupted by violence." One of Temperance's patients, a woman in her 50s whose spiritual wounds depicted scenes of cultural destruction, suddenly began speaking in a language that none of them recognized. The words flowed from her lips with increasing urgency, and as she spoke, the entities began to respond, their shadow forms swaying in rhythm with her unfamiliar phrases. Cordelia's expression shifted from satisfaction to genuine surprise. "She's speaking in the old tongue, the language of the people who lived here before. But how could she possibly know those words?" Zephyra's enhanced perception revealed the answer with crystalline clarity. The woman's spiritual wounds weren't just marking ancestral guilt, they were awakening ancestral memories that had been buried for generations. The trauma had worked both ways, creating connections that allowed the descendants of both victims and perpetrators to access knowledge that should have been lost to time. "The infection," Temperance said, her medical mind making connections that chilled her to the bone. "It's not just creating zombies. It's creating a bridge between past and present, allowing suppressed memories to surface. The infected aren't mindless. They're remembering things their conscious minds never knew." Through the church windows, they could see the infected gathering in the cemetery, but their movements had taken on an entirely different character. They were arranging themselves in patterns that resembled the symbols on the basement walls, creating a living mandala that pulsed with spiritual energy. The shambling, aggressive behavior they'd exhibited earlier had been replaced by something that looked almost ceremonial. Phoenix's evolved abilities showed her the tactical situation with devastating clarity. The entities weren't the real threat, they were arbiters, judges waiting to see whether the living could find a way to address the wounds that had been festering for centuries. The infected were trying to complete a ritual that had been interrupted by violence 300 years ago, and if they succeeded, the spiritual balance of the entire region would shift in ways that no one could predict. "We have a choice to make," Zephyra said, her engineering mind calculating possibilities with supernatural precision. "We can fight this, try to maintain the status quo and keep the past buried. Or we can help complete what was started so long ago and see what happens when historical wrongs are finally acknowledged." The woman who had been speaking in the ancient language suddenly collapsed, her body convulsing as more memories flooded through her consciousness. Temperance moved to help her, but as she touched the woman's burning skin, she gasped and jerked her hand back. For a moment, she had seen through other eyes, had experienced the terror and confusion of people watching their entire world being destroyed by strangers who spoke of salvation while bringing only death. "The memories are too much for her," Temperance diagnosed, her medical training warring with her newfound understanding of spiritual pathology. "Her mind isn't equipped to process trauma that isn't originally hers." "None of them are." One of the entities moved closer, its presence somehow both threatening and protective. "The memories must be shared if the wounds are to heal. But you are correct, no single person can bear the full weight of what was lost. The burden must be distributed among many, or it will destroy those who attempt to carry it alone." Cordelia nodded slowly, her ancient eyes reflecting the weight of centuries. "This is why I needed you three. Your enhanced abilities don't just make you better survivors, they make you capable of serving as conduits, of helping distribute the burden of memory among those strong enough to bear it." Outside, the infected had completed their arrangement in the cemetery. The pattern they'd created was visible from the church's windows, a complex geometric design that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. As Zephyra watched, she realized that the pattern wasn't random. It was a map, showing the locations of every significant atrocity that had been committed in the region. "They're trying to tell us something," Phoenix said, her enhanced perception picking up nuances in the infected's movements that had been invisible before. "Each position in the pattern corresponds to a specific historical event. They're creating a visual record of everything that was destroyed." Temperance looked at her patients with new understanding. The spiritual wounds on their skin weren't just marks of guilt, they were also maps, showing the specific connections between past and present that needed to be healed. Each person carried pieces of a larger puzzle, fragments of a story that had been deliberately scattered and hidden. "If we help them complete the ritual," she said slowly, "what happens to the people? What happens to the town?" "The truth sets them free," Cordelia replied, but her voice carried notes of uncertainty. "But freedom from historical trauma doesn't always look like what people expect. Some wounds can only be healed through profound transformation." The church bells began to toll again, but this time the sound was different, fuller, richer, as if the bronze itself had been awakened to new purpose. The entities responded to the sound by raising their shadow arms toward the vaulted ceiling, and the infected in the cemetery began to move in slow, ceremonial procession toward the church. Time was running out for hesitation. The three women stood at the center of forces that had been building for centuries, and their next decision would determine not just their own fates, but the spiritual destiny of everyone in Cedar Falls. The enhanced abilities they'd gained came with a price, the responsibility to choose wisely when the stakes were higher than any of them had ever imagined. As the first of the infected reached the church doors, their movements now purposeful rather than aggressive, Zephyra felt the weight of engineering precision applied to moral complexity. There were no simple solutions, no clean blueprints for navigating the intersection of justice and mercy. But there was still time to choose what kind of future they wanted to build from the ashes of the past. Part 7. The Ritual of Remembrance. The infected entered the church not as mindless predators, but as pilgrims returning to a shrine they had never seen but somehow remembered. Their movements were fluid now, purposeful, as they arranged themselves throughout the sanctuary according to patterns that seemed to resonate in their bones. Zephyra watched through her enhanced perception as they formed concentric circles around the altar, each person taking a position that corresponded to their spiritual connection to the land's traumatic history. Temperance's patients no longer struggled against their transformations. Instead, they seemed to be embracing them, allowing the ancestral memories to flow through their consciousness like water breaking through a dam. The elderly man whose arm bore the image of burning villages began to speak in multiple voices, recounting events he had never witnessed but somehow experienced. The middle-aged woman with the hanging tree on her forehead wept tears that seemed to carry the salt of centuries. The ritual requires willing participation, Cordelia explained, her voice taking on the cadence of ancient ceremony. Those who carry the blood of the wrongdoers must acknowledge their inheritance. Those who carry the memories of the wronged must bear witness. And those with the power to bridge both worlds, she looked directly at the three women, must serve as guides through the transformation. Phoenix's evolved instincts revealed the complexity of what was happening with overwhelming clarity. The infected weren't just random victims, they were the descendants of both perpetrators and victims, their bloodlines intertwined through generations of marriage, migration, and forgotten connections. The ritual wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about integration, about finally allowing the suppressed truths to surface and be acknowledged. Through the church windows, more figures approached, but these weren't infected. They were translucent, shimmering with the same blue light that emanated from Cordelia's flames. The original inhabitants of the land, the ones who had been murdered and scattered, were returning to witness the completion of what they had begun so long ago. Zephyr's enhanced perception showed her the structural changes occurring throughout the church. The building itself was transforming, its European architectural elements gradually giving way to something older, more organic. The stone walls sprouted living vines, the stained glass windows rearranged themselves into patterns that reflected indigenous cosmology, and the wooden pews dissolved into circles of natural seating formed from the earth itself. The land is reclaiming itself, she breathed, her engineering mind struggling to categorize transformations that defied every law of physics she knew. One of the entities approached Temperance directly, its shadow form resolving into the shape of a woman wearing traditional healer's regalia. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of accumulated wisdom. "Dr. Rivers, your medical knowledge is needed, but not in the way you've been trained to use it. The wounds we're healing aren't in the body, they're in the soul of the land itself." Temperance nodded, her understanding expanding beyond the boundaries of conventional medicine. She could see now that her patients' transformations weren't pathological, they were therapeutic, allowing buried trauma to surface so it could finally be addressed. Her role wasn't to stop the process, but to guide it, to ensure that the integration of ancestral memories didn't destroy the people experiencing them. The infected began to sing, or rather, to emit sounds that gradually resolved into harmonious music. Their voices carried melodies that predated European colonization, songs that had been sung at this exact location for thousands of years before the first church had been built on the site. The music seemed to resonate through the earth itself, awakening responses from the very stones and soil. Phoenix found herself drawn to participate in ways that her archery training had never prepared her for. Her enhanced perception showed her that her role wasn't to aim and fire, but to target the specific connections between past and present that needed to be severed or strengthened. Each gesture she made created ripples in the spiritual architecture of the space, helping to guide the flow of memory and emotion through the assembled participants. The boundary between life and death was never meant to be absolute, Cordelia said, her form becoming more solid as the ritual progressed. Indigenous peoples understood this. Death was a transition, not an ending. The violence of colonization didn't just kill bodies, it shattered the spiritual continuity that allowed the living and the dead to maintain their connections. As the singing intensified, Zephyra began to understand her own role in the unfolding ceremony. Her engineering skills weren't just about building physical structures, they were about creating frameworks that could support impossible transformations. She could see the points of stress in the spiritual architecture of the ritual, the places where the integration of past and present threatened to overwhelm the participants. With precise movements that combined her technical training with her enhanced abilities, she began to create support structures made of pure intention and will. Invisible scaffolding that could bear the weight of centuries-old trauma while allowing the healing process to continue. It was engineering on a metaphysical level, using principles that no textbook had ever described but that her transformed consciousness somehow understood. The translucent figures outside the church began to enter, moving through the walls as if they were made of mist. These were the original victims, the ones whose deaths had created the spiritual wound that was finally being addressed. They didn't appear angry or vengeful. Instead, they radiated a profound sadness mixed with hope, as if they had been waiting centuries for this moment of acknowledgement. Temperance worked among the participants, monitoring their vital signs as they underwent transformations that should have been medically impossible. Heart rates that spiked beyond survivable levels but somehow stabilized, brain activity that showed patterns consistent with multiple personalities occupying the same consciousness, and skin temperatures that fluctuated between feverish heat and deathly cold. "They're integrating multiple timelines," she reported, her voice filled with wonder and concern. "Their consciousness is expanding to include experiences from different historical periods. It's like watching someone live through several lifetimes simultaneously." The young boy who had mentioned his grandmother's story stood at the center of the developing mandala, his small form somehow serving as an anchor point for the swirling energies. When he spoke, his voice carried authority that belonged to someone much older. "The grandmother spirits say it's time for the final choice. The living can release the past and accept responsibility for healing, or they can cling to ignorance and let the wounds continue to fester." Through her enhanced perception, Phoenix could see the choice points crystallizing around each participant. Threads of possibility stretched out in multiple directions, showing the potential futures that could emerge from this moment. Some paths led to healing and integration, where the descendants of both victims and perpetrators could work together to address historical wrongs. Others led to continued cycles of violence and suppression, where the trauma would be buried once again only to resurface in future generations. As the ritual reached its crescendo, all three women realized that their own transformations were far from complete. The enhanced abilities they had gained were just the beginning of a journey that would require them to redefine everything they thought they knew about survival, justice, and the nature of reality itself. The infected, the entities, and the translucent spirits all turned toward them expectantly, waiting for their final decision about whether to help complete the ritual or to fight against forces that had been building for 3 centuries. Part 8. The New Dawn. The moment of choice arrived like the first light of dawn breaking through storm clouds. Zephyra, Phoenix, and Temperance stood at the fulcrum of history, their enhanced abilities allowing them to perceive the full weight of what their decision would unleash. The ritual had reached its climax, and the spiritual architecture of Cedar Falls hung in perfect balance, waiting for them to tip the scales toward healing or continued suppression. Zephyra was the first to step forward, her engineer's mind having calculated all possible outcomes and found only one that offered true structural integrity for the future. "We help complete it," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through both the physical and spiritual dimensions of the church. "The foundation has been compromised for too long. We need to rebuild from bedrock up." Phoenix nodded, her archer's instincts recognizing that this wasn't about hitting a target, it was about creating one. "The trajectory of history has been distorted by unacknowledged trauma. If we want a different future, we have to correct the path from its source." Temperance stepped between her transformed patients, her medical training finally expanded to encompass healing that went beyond the physical. "The infection was never the disease," she said, her hands glowing with newfound understanding. "It was the cure. The real pathology was the silence, the forgetting, the refusal to acknowledge wounds that never stopped bleeding." As the 3 women joined hands, forming a triangle at the center of the assembled participants, the ritual reached its completion. The boundaries between past and present dissolved entirely, allowing centuries of suppressed truth to flow through the consciousness of everyone present. The infected sang with voices that carried the accumulated wisdom of generations, while the translucent spirits of the original inhabitants finally found the acknowledgement they had been seeking. Cordelia's form began to change, her ancient presence becoming something both more and less than human. "The debt is acknowledged," she proclaimed, her voice echoing through dimensions that mortal ears had never been designed to hear. The silence is broken. The healing can begin. But healing, they discovered, was not the gentle process that any of them had imagined. As the ritual reached its conclusion, the transformations that had begun in individual participants spread throughout Cedar Falls like ripples in a cosmic pond. Every descendant of the original colonists experienced the sudden awakening of ancestral memories, while every person with indigenous heritage found themselves connected to spiritual traditions that had been thought lost forever. The town itself underwent metamorphosis. Buildings constructed on sites of historical significance crumbled and were replaced by structures that grew from the earth itself, organic architecture that reflected the spiritual needs of the community rather than the economic desires of developers. The cemetery became a garden where the living and the dead could commune openly, without the artificial barriers that had separated them for centuries. Zephyra found her engineering skills evolving beyond anything she had previously imagined. She could design and build structures that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, creating spaces where the past and present could coexist without conflict. Her first project was a memorial that served as both a monument to historical atrocities and a functional community center where descendants of all parties could work together on healing initiatives. Phoenix's archery transformed into something that could only be described as metaphysical marksmanship. She could target not just physical objects, but conceptual ones, shooting arrows of intention that could strike down prejudice, pierce through willful ignorance, and hit the bullseye of truth even when it was hidden behind layers of comfortable lies. Her role became that of a spiritual scout, identifying the places where similar rituals of acknowledgement were needed. Temperance discovered that her medical practice now encompassed healing that operated on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. She could treat not just physical ailments, but the spiritual infections that passed through bloodlines, the psychological wounds created by historical trauma, and the social pathologies that emerged when communities refused to acknowledge their own complicity in ongoing injustices. But the transformation of Cedar Falls was only the beginning. As word spread of what had occurred, other communities built on sites of historical atrocities began experiencing their own awakenings. The spiritual infections that had been dormant for generations started surfacing wherever the past had been deliberately forgotten or suppressed. The three women found themselves at the center of a movement that was simultaneously ancient and unprecedented. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Many people preferred the comfortable myths of heroic pioneers and civilizing missions to the complex realities of colonization and cultural destruction. Some communities chose to fight against their own awakenings, leading to conflicts that played out on both physical and spiritual battlefields. Years passed, and the three women aged, but their enhanced abilities grew stronger rather than weaker. They became teachers, showing others how to navigate the integration of historical trauma without being destroyed by it. They established schools where children learned not just conventional subjects, but how to perceive and work with the spiritual architecture that underlay all human communities. Cedar Falls became a pilgrimage site for people seeking to understand how healing could emerge from acknowledgement of historical wrongs. The town thrived in ways that transcended economic measures, becoming a place where the artificial boundaries between different ways of knowing dissolved into something richer and more complex. But late at night, when the aurora borealis danced across skies that had never seen such lights before the awakening, the three women would sometimes gather in the transformed church and remember the weight of their choice. They had saved their friend and their community, but they had also unleashed forces that would continue reshaping the world for generations to come. Cordelia still appeared to them occasionally, no longer the ancient spirit of vengeance she had once been, but something closer to a guardian of transformation. "You chose correctly," she would tell them, her form now more light than shadow. "But remember that every healing creates new possibilities for both good and ill. The work of integration is never finished." As Zephyra, Phoenix, and Temperance entered their later years, they trained successors to carry on their work. The enhanced abilities they had gained could be taught, they discovered, but only to those who were willing to accept the full responsibility that came with them. Not everyone who sought such powers was prepared for the moral complexity they entailed. The world beyond Cedar Falls continued to struggle with the implications of awakened historical consciousness. Some regions embraced the difficult work of acknowledgement and healing, while others doubled down on mythologies that painted their histories in uncomplicated heroic terms. The spiritual infections in these resistant areas grew stronger and more dangerous, creating pockets of intensified conflict and denial. But in Cedar Falls, something unprecedented had taken root. A community had learned to live with the full complexity of its history, neither denying the darkness nor allowing it to overshadow the possibility of redemption. The living and the dead coexisted in harmony, the past and present informed each other without either dominating, and the future stretched ahead with possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. On quiet evenings, the three women would walk through their transformed town, marveling at how much had changed since that day when they first encountered the infected in the streets. The creatures that had once seemed like mindless monsters were revealed to have been the harbingers of a healing that the world desperately needed, even if it didn't know how to ask for it. Their story became legend, told and retold in communities around the world where similar awakenings were beginning to occur. But those who knew them best understood that their greatest achievement wasn't the supernatural abilities they had gained or the spiritual transformations they had facilitated. It was their willingness to choose the difficult path of truth over the comfortable path of denial, even when they couldn't fully predict where that choice would lead. As the sun set on their final years, Zephyra, Phoenix, and Temperance found peace in the knowledge that they had helped birth something genuinely new in the world, a way of being human that honored both the darkness and the light of history, that acknowledged wounds without being defined by them, and that offered hope for healing even in the face of seemingly insurmountable trauma. The infected had stopped appearing in Cedar Falls long ago, their purpose fulfilled. But the three women knew that in other places, other communities would eventually face their own moments of reckoning. And when that time came, there would be people prepared to help guide them through the transformation, carrying forward the lessons learned in a small town where the past and present had finally learned to dance together rather than war against each other. Their legacy lived on in the enhanced abilities they had taught to others, in the healing practices they had developed, and most importantly, in the model they had created for how communities could face their darkest histories and emerge not broken, but whole. The ultimate test of survival had never been about defeating the zombies. It had been about finding the courage to remember what had been forgotten and to transform that remembrance into something that could nurture life rather than perpetuate death. In the end, the strongest American women with extraordinary skills had done more than survive. They had shown the world what it looked like to heal.